Hello and welcome to Bad Astra. Today we will be interviewing Amy Tang. Amy is a PhD candidate in the Shirokov group at the University of Chicago. Her research involves developing microwave kinetic inductance detectors, MIKDs, a type of superconducting detector, to study the cosmic microwave background, or CMB. She is trying to develop novel optical detectors that have the low noise sensitivities needed for CMB observations. Her day to day work ranges from designing and running electromagnetic simulations of the detectors to fabricating and testing and characterizing the detectors she makes. Most importantly, Amy has two cats, both of whom are incredibly lovely, and one of whom has licked me and given me tongue shaped rashes on my hand and chin because I'm so allergic to cats. And truly, I felt blessed to have been chosen. Oh, Amy, it looks like your video's not working.
No, my video should be on.
Okay, but I just see a picture of your cat.
That's me.
Oh, oh, you are the cat. Okay, then maybe it's frozen because I just see you asleep on a window, arms outstretched.
Yeah, I'm just very chill right now.
That's good. I want all of my interviews with scientists to be chill. So, to clarify, you are an orange cat currently sunning yourself with your eyes
Yes.
closed.
Yes.
Okay, well, let's continue with the interview. So, Amy, the cat scientist, what is cosmology?
In astronomy, we study the stuff that's in our sky. And in particular, for cosmology, we're trying to understand the very, very early universe. So generally, this means that we are trying to look at things that are like outside, I would say, like the scope of Milky Way. So this has a very, very large range of what kind of things that you're interested in looking at. So we study things all the way from right after Big Bang to things that happened like around like a few billion years ago. Even though that sound like it's very it's a very long time ago, but then the cosmological perspective is still pretty recent.
So, you study very far away things, very long ago things
Yeah,
to the present.
yeah.
Alright. In the description I read of you, it talks about your work with cosmic microwave background. So, for our viewers, what is the cosmic microwave background?
Sure. So the cosmic microwave background is a pretty amazing tool that we have to try to understand early cosmology. You can sort of think of it as like a baby picture of the universe when it was just about 380,000 years old after the Big Bang, which is the beginning of the universe. So before this, the universe was still really hot, and it was hot enough that light wasn't actually able to escape. And so, what I mean by that is that during that time, a photon emitted wouldn't travel very far at all before it interacted with another particle. So, you can think of everything that we know in the universe, photons, the baryons, like normal matter, all meshed together in this giant soup. And so, there wasn't really light during that time. So, the universe was opaque. Eventually, the universe expanded and cooled enough so that light was able to escape this big giant soup. And then that light that first was able to stream out became known as the cosmic microwave background. So today, due to the expansion of the universe, the light can be observed with a peak frequency of about 150 gigahertz, which is in the like microwave or far infrared regime of the light spectrum. And what's really cool about the CMB is that unlike the other astrophysical sources, is like literally everywhere around us. So you can make a whole map of the CMB, like observing all around us. In fact, for those of you who might be old enough to remember back in the days when you had to tune like the frequency channel of your TV, the static that you saw between the channels, like a small percentage of that actually comes from the CMB. So because the CMB was emitted at such an early time in the universe, there's really no other tool that we can use to probe what the universe was like. And so there's all sorts of really cool, interesting physics that's embedded in the CMB that can inform us about what the universe is like now. And how the universe evolved to be the way it is. And so, for example, the CMB can tell us things like what the geometry of the universe is, how much dark matter there is in the universe, along with answers to many, many, many other cosmology questions. And even though there's a lot of really cool science that has been done already with the CMB, there's still lots to do. So it's still a really exciting field of cosmology.
So, Amy, could you explain the Big Bang Theory in 5 minutes, just like I'm five?
Yeah, so the Big Bang Theory is the current model that we astronomers have of how our universe began. The current hypothesis is that the universe was born 13.8 billion years ago from singularity. And like I mentioned before, the universe was super, super hot. So the physics was really weird and wonky during that time. So immediately after the Big Bang, the universe has started to expand and cool down. By around like 1 second after the Big Bang occurred, things like electron and proton were able to form. And after a few minutes, the universe started producing things like deuterium and helium, and so on. Eventually, light was able to decouple from matter to form the CMB that I talked about earlier. And even longer after that, the universe started to grow structures that eventually forms the stars and galaxies that we see today. So it's pretty cool to think about all that exists in our universe began with the moment of Big Bang.
So, Amy, could you tell me a little bit about your day-to-day research? What is that like? Could you tell me about your personal research projects, both recent ones if you've just finished any up, and current ones if you are currently working on anything?
Right now, my research is on building detectors that go into telescopes to look at light. So, this field of astronomy is commonly known as like instrumentation. In astronomy, you need different types of detector depending on what kind of light you're observing. So, to give you one example, for optical telescopes like the Hubble Space Telescope, the type of detector that's used is called charge coupled device or CCDs, where you convert incoming photons into electrons. But for what we're doing in the microwave and far infrared regimes, things are a little bit different. Since the photons in our frequency range aren't energetic enough to generate the electrons in a CCD. So our field generally uses superconducting detectors that are cool to ultra low temperatures. So around less than 1 degree above absolute zero. So very, very cold. Since these detectors offer the best sensitivity and produce very low noise levels. Now, the type of detector that I work with, as you mentioned earlier, is called a microwave kinetic inductance detector, or MKIDS. What we do is we design a superconducting metal into a resonance circuit whose property changes when it's exposed to light. So what we do is first come up with a design for the detector, figure out how to get the light onto the detector. For example, this might involve, say, an antenna and a transmission line to bring the light signal from our antenna to our resonance circuit, and how we are going to read out our detectors. And then so once we come up with that design, we fabricate it using very similar processes as how people make commercial computer chips, and then we test it and see if it behaves the way that we designed it to. After that, we try to improve our design or debug any issues that come up and repeat this process until we have a detector ready to go in a telescope.
That's really cool. So, your instruments that go into telescopes, can you tell us a little bit more about how that fits into the overall field of cosmology? Like, what are these telescopes then used for?
The telescopes that I'm working with is typically in the millimeter wave to like sub-millimeter wave. So that's like the wavelength of light that we're interested in. And so this field of observation, so we call that like far infrared observation, is actually a relatively new like wavelength of light that we were able to access. And this is because traditionally, that wavelength of light, like there's a lot of atmospheric absorptions that happen. So you don't get that much, you're not really able to get as much light as if you're in other wavelengths, like say the optical wavelengths. And so this is why a lot of these telescopes are located in really like high up and really dry environments like Chile or the South Pole. One of the applications for telescopes operating in this wavelength is the detection of CMB that we talked about earlier. But another use for these telescopes is looking at high redshift dusty galaxies. These galaxies are super, super old. So high redshift dusty galaxies are interesting because they are, well, as the name suggests, like enshrouded by dust. And so what that means is that normally, like the UV and optical light that are produced by like really bright stars are able to shine through, and that's how we observe these galaxies. But for these galaxies that are really dusty, the dust in the galaxies absorbs that light and then re-emits it in the far infrared regime. So you are actually not able to see these galaxies if you move into like another wavelength. Often these galaxies are only found through millimeter wave detection. And these galaxies are particularly interesting because they're very active in star formation. So because these are very, very early, these galaxies exist in a very, 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 very early universe. So you can learn a lot about like how our galaxies were first able to evolve and form by these observations, just because we actually don't have a lot of data and observation from galaxies that early in the universe.
You're building instruments for telescopes to observe in this relatively new wavelength, uh, to detect galaxies kind of at the far reaches of our observable universe. So, really, really long time ago. So, unlike some of the astronomers we've had on before, you're actually building the telescopes rather than making the measurements or coming up with the theories.
Yes.
I really think it's cool how there are basically three different types of astronomers. Like you have astronomers who do theory and computation, like my wife and like Nora. You have astronomers that do observation, like Maya, who we interviewed earlier. And then astronomers like you and John, who I'll interview later, who do instrumentation. Like, I think it's really cool that people with such different skill sets and interests can all work in the same field and work towards similar goals.
So my kind of work isn't really in line with traditional astronomy work. So I don't really think about stuff in the sky in my day-to-day work at all, really. And so I find instrumentation really interesting because it's an intersection of astronomy with condensed matter physics and microwave engineering. So you get to like dabble in a lot of different fields in this type of work. However, this work is very much vital to the field of astronomy. I mean, after all, you need to know what the limits of your telescopes are when you make any observations. When you get the on-sky data to analyze it, you need to know how that data was made, and like after you find like signal or make a detection, then you need to be able to put error bars on that data to make full use out of it. And so this is why my type of work is still very important in the field of astronomy.
So, Amy, I know that after you finish your PhD, you don't plan on staying in academia. What type of research will you be doing after you graduate?
So I'll be going into the field of quantum computing. It's still like a research job. I'm really interested in doing research, but now my applications are a little bit different. So rather than thinking about like stuff on the sky and astronomy, I'll be more focused on doing like condensed matter stuff and quantum physics. Now, this is actually very common in my field of work, just because we work with superconducting detectors, and a lot of quantum computing companies also use superconducting detectors in their research. So you can see that there's a very smooth transition from the type of work that I do to someone working at a quantum computing company.
That's really cool. And I love how completely different research fields can use the same methods, and how skills gained in academia or developed further in academia can be applied to the real world, or I shouldn't say the real world.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think there's a lot of transferable skills. So for me, since I do instrumentation, this was the field that I was able to transition into very easily. But I know that people who work on observation or theory, a lot of astronomers end up being data scientists just because a lot of them work with really big data. So there's even though even if you get into astronomy and you realize that like, oh, this might not be something that I'm interested in doing long term, there are still other avenues that are open to you.
I think that is really important advice for anyone who is either currently working on an astronomy PhD or considering working on an astronomy PhD. I know that my wife is planning on becoming a professor in astronomy, but most of the people getting astronomy PhDs aren't necessarily. And I think that's important to know.
Yes, absolutely.
So, do you have any advice for high school and early college students who are thinking about going into research, either specifically in astronomy or just in any STEM field?
Yeah, so for those of you who are thinking of doing astronomy as a career, my advice would be keep learning about astronomy and make sure you have a really strong foundation in physics, math, and maybe also programming. Astronomy is becoming increasingly a data-driven science, and so programming skills and knowledge in statistics are becoming more and more valuable. And also keep up to date with the latest astronomy news. Luckily, I think astronomy is a fairly public-friendly science field, so your local planetarium or science museums might have some really cool events that's happening. So be on the lookout for things like that. For college or university students, if you're thinking of going to grad school for astronomy, try your best to get research opportunity during your undergrad to see if this is really what you want to do. And if your school doesn't offer any research opportunities, there are still might be some other programs that are available to you. You just might have to do some more research.
I love that advice because it's very similar to advice from previous interviews, like learn to code, keep up with astronomy news, and do research. I think especially learn to code and doing research are very common strains I hear. So I like that there's a consistent level of advice. Amy, you are an international student. You did your undergraduate in Montreal. Do you have any advice specifically for international students from Canada or otherwise applying to US institutions?
I would say that like for me as a Canadian, I think like the education systems between Canada and US aren't that drastically different. But I would say for international students in general, I think it's a good idea to reach out to professors that you're interested in working beforehand, just to make that initial connection. I like like a lot of times you might not hear back, but there might be some opportunities where professors are actively looking for students. So if you make that connection, I think that would be really good. Yeah, and I would say that just be careful about like the timing of things. So the deadlines of American schools are quite different than like schools from other places. So I know like Europe has a slightly different timeline, and other places as well. So when you're applying to schools, keep that in mind. And I think and specifically for American schools, you have to take the GREs, which most other places don't require you to. So for the GREs, that is just an extra step of preparation. And I think a lot of people, if you're planning to take the GRE and you're not really familiar with it, generally start studying in your third year. That will be like a good time to start. At least in my experience applying to Canadian schools, the biggest difference I saw was that like the schools in Canada were a little bit more focused on grades, whereas the US schools were a little bit more holistic. So they cared like in addition to grades, your research and your letters also matter a lot, and as well as your GRE scores. So there are more factors to consider when you send in an application.
I didn't realize the thing about the deadlines being different.
Yeah, I know like some people who apply like to schools in Europe, like they had to send it. I forgot. I think like they had to tell them if they were coming or not before they even heard back from like the US schools or something. Yeah, one of one way or the other. Like in any case, like it's in some cases like the deadlines are not overlapping at all. So that's something to keep in mind.
That's really important. And I'm sure just researching schools in a different country is probably difficult. So, Amy, I know that not everybody wants to study astronomy in an academic setting. I don't understand those people, but they exist. Do you have any advice for people who want to keep up with astronomy or learn about astronomy, but don't necessarily want to study it formally, or who just don't like math?
So I think there are quite a lot of popular science books that focus on astronomy. So starting with your local library, if you want to learn more, is a good idea. Again, your local planetarium or science museums will often have interesting events or exhibits. Personally, I've been involved with small astronomy enthusiast clubs where they do trips to the countryside to do observation with portable telescopes, which can be a really nice experience. And lastly, I would say that astronomy is a field that's heavily involved in outreach. So chances are your local university's astronomy department club will have some outreach program that's happening where you get a chance to hear more from an astronomer doing cool research.
Thank you so much to Amy Tang for stopping by and agreeing to be interviewed on her instrumentation research.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you to all the viewers who made it to the end of this interview. Remember to always keep an open mind. Astra out.
Ad Astra, to the stars, to the stars.